In the world of high-powered corporate ladders, there's a story that stands out, one that transcends adversity, resilience, and the kind of determination that seems almost impossible. Imagine being laughed at during your very first job interview, mocked for your appearance, your background, and your potential. Now picture that same company, years later, being led by none other than the person who was once the subject of that ridicule. It's a tale that shows the true power of persistence, self-belief, and the incredible transformation that can happen when someone refuses to be defined by the limitations others try to place on them. This story isn't just about a job interview gone wrong. It's about a young black teen, full of hope and ambition, walking into an office that was cold and unfamiliar, where he was judged long before he had the chance to show who he truly was. The interview was supposed to be his big break, a step forward toward a better life. But what he didn't expect was to face a series of mocking comments from the very people who held the future of his career in their hands. Instead of seeing a bright, eager individual with potential, they saw a stereotype, and the interview quickly became more about dismissing his dreams than recognizing his talent. But this teen had something most of them didn't see: he had drive. Even though he walked out of that interview feeling crushed, something inside of him told him to keep going. The sting of their laughter echoed in his mind, but instead of letting it break him, it fueled him. He made a promise to himself that he would prove them wrong. Little did anyone know, that moment of humiliation would be the spark that ignited a journey toward unimaginable success. As the years went on, this young man faced obstacle after obstacle. Each challenge, from systemic barriers to personal struggles, seemed to be a test of his spirit. But each setback only hardened his resolve. He took every opportunity he could find, worked tirelessly, and slowly but surely, he began to rise. The same company that had once laughed at him became a stepping stone, and his journey took him from one job to the next, always pushing him closer to his goal. Eventually, the day came when he had built a reputation for himself, a reputation based not on the color of his skin or where he came from, but on his skill, intelligence, and unbreakable will. It wasn't long before the very same company that had mocked him came calling, needing someone to lead them. The irony wasn't lost on him. What had started with laughter now became an opportunity, a chance to claim the very position he had once been told he would never deserve. But how did he get there? What exactly happened in those years between the laughter and the moment he sat in the CEO's chair? The road to success wasn't easy, and along the way, there were moments of doubt, of uncertainty, of wanting to give up. There were people who tried to hold him back, who doubted him, and who tried to place him in boxes that weren't his to fit. But in the end, it was his resilience, his intelligence, and his relentless desire to prove himself that brought him back to that office, sitting in the chair that was always meant for him. As we continue this journey, we'll explore the key moments that defined his path. We'll delve into the struggles he faced, the choices he made, and the mindset that drove him to push past every obstacle. His story is more than just one of personal triumph, it's a powerful reminder that laughter, judgment, and the expectations others place on us don't have to define our future. In fact, they can be the very things that push us to achieve greatness. But before we continue, think for a moment, what would you have done in his shoes? Would you have walked away from the laughter, or would you have found the strength to keep going? Would you have let their doubts become your own? Or would you have turned that laughter into fuel for your own journey, just as he did? Stay tuned, because the best part of this incredible story is still to come. What happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about success, perseverance, and the true power of self-belief. The years following that unforgettable interview were not easy for him. As he moved through different jobs, each experience seemed to bring a new layer of struggle. There were days when he felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, constantly proving himself, always feeling like he had to work twice as hard as others just to be seen. The world around him was full of voices telling him that he wasn't enough, that he would never reach the top. But there was a quiet voice inside him, a voice that kept saying, "Keep going." He faced microaggressions, subtle but painful moments that reminded him he was different. There were times when he'd walk into a room and feel like all eyes were on him, not in a way that welcomed him, but as though he was an outsider, an intruder. He saw his colleagues advancing, while he stayed in positions that felt more like dead ends than stepping stones. But it didn't matter how many doors were slammed in his face. He had learned that doors didn't always open the way you expect, but sometimes, you had to build your own. One thing he quickly realized was that his background, his story, the way he looked, none of that mattered as much as his work ethic and his ability to learn. While others around him were content with mediocrity, he sought out knowledge, constantly looking for ways to improve himself and refine his skills. He spent nights reading, learning about business management, strategy, and leadership. He understood that to succeed in the corporate world, he needed more than just talent. He needed strategy, knowledge, and the ability to adapt to every situation. It wasn't long before his hard work began to pay off. His reputation for being reliable, resourceful, and committed started to grow. People began to notice. He was no longer just a guy who had been laughed at in an interview, he was becoming the person others turned to for solutions. But even with his growing success, there were still moments where he felt like an outsider. There were still people who doubted him, who tried to undermine his progress, who questioned whether someone like him could truly lead. Then came the pivotal moment, an opportunity that he had been waiting for, though he didn't know it at the time. The company that had once laughed at him, the company that had rejected him so callously, was going through a rough patch. The leadership was in turmoil, the business wasn't performing as it had in the past, and they needed someone to take the reins. At first, he was hesitant. The memories of that interview, of the mockery, lingered in his mind. How could he go back to that place, knowing how they had treated him? But then, he realized something that changed everything. This was no longer about them, it was about him. He had grown, he had transformed, and he was now more than ready to take on whatever challenge lay ahead. This was his moment, the one he had been working toward for all those years. He knew that his story, his struggle, his resilience, was exactly what the company needed to turn things around. He applied for the role of CEO, a position that seemed almost too far out of reach. But he wasn't applying for a job just to have a title, he was applying to prove something, not just to the company but to himself. He had spent years being underestimated, dismissed, and rejected. Now, it was time to turn that narrative on its head. He was ready to lead with the knowledge and experience he had gained, with the drive and passion that had sustained him through all the setbacks. When the call came, it wasn't the sound of triumph he expected, it was the realization that all of his dreams had come full circle. He had done it. He was now in the seat of power, the very seat that had once been the object of his deepest doubts. But as he walked into that boardroom, taking his place at the head of the table, something felt different. The people who had once looked down on him, who had mocked him, now they had no choice but to acknowledge the man he had become. As he sat at the helm of the company, he was determined not to be just another CEO. He wanted to create a culture where people were seen for their talents, not their appearances. He knew all too well how it felt to be judged based on things that didn't matter. He was committed to making the workplace a space where everyone could thrive, where people were given the opportunity to rise, regardless of their background, race, or identity. But his journey was far from over. As the new CEO, he faced challenges that tested his leadership in ways he hadn't anticipated. People in the company were skeptical, resistant to change, and still unsure about this new leader at the top. There were those who had supported him early on, but there were also those who wanted to see him fail. As he navigated this new world of corporate politics, he had to dig deep, tapping into the lessons he had learned over the years, the ones that had come from all the failures, the doubts, and the rejection. Was he truly ready for this responsibility? Could he steer the company to success despite the skepticism that surrounded him? Or would he falter under the weight of expectations? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain, he was not going to let the past define him. He had already proven that no one could tell him what he could or couldn't do. And so, the real journey began. Would he be the leader this company needed, or would the same challenges that once tried to bring him down threaten his reign at the top? Stay tuned to find out how the once dismissed teen who was laughed at in an interview went on to lead a company, and whether he would rise to the occasion or fall victim to the very system that had tried to hold him back. As the days went by, the challenges of leadership were far more intense than he had anticipated. Despite the initial excitement of securing the CEO position, reality soon set in. The company was struggling, and there were many who believed that he was simply a temporary solution, someone who wouldn't last in such a high-pressure role. He could feel the eyes of the board members and senior executives on him, waiting for him to slip, waiting for him to prove that he didn't belong. But he was determined not to be that person, the one who gave up when the going got tough. Every morning, as he walked into the office, he reminded himself that he wasn't there by accident. He had earned his place, step by step, through years of hard work and persistence. He had faced rejection, mockery, and countless hurdles. Now, he would face these new challenges head-on, with the same unyielding spirit that had carried him this far. The company's troubles ran deep. There were budget cuts to navigate, a lack of innovation in the product line, and a disconnection between the upper management and the employees on the ground. People had lost their trust in leadership. Morale was low, and the competition was fierce. But he wasn't about to let this company fall apart just because it had hit a rough patch. He knew that turning things around wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't happen overnight. But he believed in transformation. He believed that anything could change with the right mindset and the right team behind it. One of his first moves as CEO was to reconnect with the employees. He didn't want to be seen as just a figurehead sitting in a plush office, making decisions from afar. He wanted to understand the company from the ground up, to know what it felt like to be in the trenches. So, he spent the next few weeks visiting different departments, talking to employees, and listening to their concerns. Many of them were skeptical at first. After all, who could blame them? They had seen CEOs come and go, each one promising change, but never delivering. Yet, as they began to see his genuine commitment, things started to shift. His authenticity began to speak for itself. It wasn't just about the employees, though. He knew that in order to steer the company back on course, he needed to make some tough decisions with the board of directors. They had their own doubts, questioning his ability to lead a company of this size. They had expected someone more traditional, someone with a more conventional path to the top. But he wasn't just someone who had climbed the corporate ladder step by step, he was someone who had been shaped by his experiences. His perspective was different, and that was exactly what the company needed. During one particularly intense meeting, the tension in the room was palpable. He could sense that the board members were waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to falter. But he stood his ground, articulating his vision for the company with clarity and confidence. He wasn't just talking about profitability or growth, he was talking about the kind of culture he wanted to build, one where innovation was encouraged, where people weren't just seen as cogs in the machine, but as individuals with ideas and potential. He spoke about diversity, about bringing in new perspectives, and about breaking free from the outdated practices that had been holding the company back. Despite his passionate presentation, there were still murmurs of doubt. The board wasn't entirely convinced. Some felt that he was being too idealistic, that he didn't fully grasp the complexity of the challenges they faced. But he didn't let that discourage him. He knew that this was a battle he had to win, not just for himself, but for the future of the company. He wasn't going to back down. As the weeks turned into months, the company's fortunes began to change, but it wasn't because of any one decision. It was because he had been consistent, persistent, and, above all, he had stayed true to his vision. Slowly but surely, he began to see results. Employee satisfaction improved, innovation started to flow, and the company's financials began to show signs of recovery. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for the first time in a long while, there was hope. However, even as things began to improve, there were still moments of doubt, both from within and outside the company. The skepticism never fully went away. Some people were still waiting for him to fail, to prove that he didn't belong in the role. He could feel the weight of those expectations pressing on him every day. But each time he faced a challenge, he remembered where he had come from, the teen who had walked into that interview, laughed at and underestimated, but who had risen from the ashes of rejection. He wasn't going to let anyone's doubts dictate his journey. And then came the ultimate test. A rival company, one that had been eyeing their market share for months, launched a series of aggressive moves. They had the resources, the influence, and the experience to take down anyone who stood in their way. For a moment, it felt like everything he had worked for was on the brink of collapse. The pressure mounted, and the decisions became harder. But this time, he wasn't alone. His team had grown stronger, and they believed in him. They trusted his leadership, his vision, and his ability to make the tough calls. Together, they strategized, adapted, and fought back with everything they had. The battle for market dominance was fierce, but they didn't back down. Would he be able to overcome this final challenge? Would he secure the future of the company, or would the story of the teen who was laughed at during an interview come to an end with a bitter defeat? Stay tuned, because the next chapter is about to unfold, and it might just be the most surprising twist yet. As the days went on, the pressure mounted. His phone was constantly buzzing with messages, emails, and notifications from board members, clients, and employees, all demanding his attention. Everyone had their own expectations, their own agenda. They wanted answers, and they wanted results, now. But the path forward wasn't clear. In fact, it felt more like a labyrinth with no clear exit. There were moments when he felt completely overwhelmed, like he was standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing but darkness below. Every decision he made seemed to carry weight. Every wrong move could lead to disastrous consequences. The board meetings became even more tense. The skeptics who had doubted him from the beginning grew louder, their voices filled with criticisms and suggestions that felt more like demands. They wanted to know when the company would start turning a profit again. They wanted a roadmap, something concrete to assure them that their investment was safe. But he couldn't promise them a quick fix. He had a vision for the company, one that focused on long-term growth, sustainability, and creating a culture where people felt valued. Yet, every time he shared his plans, there was hesitation in the room. They didn't fully trust his approach. His mind often raced late into the night, running through different strategies, weighing the potential risks and rewards. He knew that he couldn't afford to play it safe anymore. The company had been in decline for years, and to revive it, he needed to take bold risks. But bold risks came with consequences. What if they didn't work? What if he failed? Despite the mounting pressure, he knew that failure wasn't an option. He had already come so far, fighting for his place at the table, enduring rejection, mockery, and skepticism from so many. Now, he had a chance to change not just the company's fate, but his own legacy. He couldn't let fear hold him back. But that didn't mean he wasn't scared. In the quiet moments, when it was just him alone with his thoughts, doubt crept in. He had spent so many years proving himself, overcoming obstacles that seemed insurmountable. What if this was the one challenge that he couldn't rise above? He couldn't afford to let those doubts consume him. He had learned that if you let fear control your actions, you lose before you even begin. So, he pressed on, using every tool he had, his creativity, his determination, and his ability to connect with others. He spent more time with the employees, getting to know them not just as workers, but as people. He wanted to understand their frustrations, their ideas, and their dreams. After all, it was their passion and dedication that would drive the company's success. He didn't just want to be the CEO of a company, he wanted to be the leader of a movement. A movement that prioritized people over profits, creativity over conformity, and growth over stagnation. Yet, as he worked tirelessly to rebuild the company, there were still those who didn't believe in his vision. They questioned his ability to lead, despite the small wins that were beginning to show. There was one board member in particular, Daniel Reynolds, who seemed determined to undermine him at every turn. Reynolds had been in the business world for decades. He was sharp, calculating, and had made his fortune in industries that were as cutthroat as they came. He didn't believe in his vision of a company driven by values rather than just numbers. To him, business was about making money, not about creating a culture or empowering employees. Reynolds often challenged him in meetings, questioning his decisions and pushing for more conventional, more profitable routes. But he wasn't easily swayed. He had learned long ago that success didn't come from taking the easy path, it came from perseverance, from believing in something greater than short-term gain. And yet, the tension between them continued to grow. Reynolds wasn't the only one who was skeptical. The more traditional members of the board were starting to grow restless. They had seen enough of the new guy and wanted to see immediate results. But the real test wasn't the boardroom. It was what was happening outside the company. The rival corporation that had been eyeing their market share wasn't just a threat, they were a force to be reckoned with. Their CEO, Melissa Chan, was a seasoned leader who had built her empire with ruthless efficiency. She was everything that he was not, calm, collected, and calculated. While he was still learning the ropes of leading a major corporation, she had already mastered the game. Her company was growing rapidly, while his was still struggling to stay afloat. He had known from the beginning that competition would be fierce. But what he didn't anticipate was just how far Melissa would go to dominate the market. Her company began launching new products that were strikingly similar to his own, undercutting his pricing and attracting key clients that had once been loyal to his brand. Every move she made felt like a direct attack, and he couldn't help but feel that she was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. As the competition heated up, the pressure on him grew unbearable. Every meeting with his team felt more like a battlefield. The whispers of doubt grew louder, and even some of the employees who had initially supported him began to question his leadership. Would he be able to keep the company afloat? Would he be able to outsmart the competition? Or would this be the moment where it all came crashing down? Through it all, he kept his focus. He knew that the company's survival depended on their ability to innovate and adapt. He began working with his team on new strategies, brainstorming ideas for products and services that could differentiate them from the competition. He wasn't going to beat Melissa at her own game, he would change the rules. His approach was different. It wasn't just about competing, it was about creating something that mattered, something that would connect with people on a deeper level. But as they started to roll out new initiatives, the opposition didn't let up. Melissa's company launched a major advertising campaign, aimed directly at his company's weaknesses. The stakes were higher than ever, and as the pressure continued to mount, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play. Was it just business, or was there something personal behind Melissa's aggression? Why was she so determined to take him down? Every corner he turned seemed to bring a new challenge, a new obstacle. Yet, through it all, he never forgot what had gotten him this far. He had fought his way to the top once, and he would do it again. The question was, would he be able to turn the tide in time, or would the pressure finally break him? The days felt like weeks, and the weeks felt like months. The weight of the pressure bore down on him constantly, like an unshakable cloud hanging over every decision, every meeting, and every conversation. But the more the pressure built, the more he relied on his instincts, the same instincts that had carried him from the depths of uncertainty to the highest seat in the company. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his path. Melissa's moves were strategic, precise, and relentless. She was no stranger to the game, and she knew exactly how to use the media, pricing tactics, and new technology to her advantage. His company had always been a little behind on the technological front, but he wasn't going to let that define their future. He knew he couldn't compete head-to-head with her in terms of resources, but he could find other ways to challenge her dominance. It wasn't about having the biggest budget, it was about having the most creative, driven team. He had started meeting with his leadership team more often, brainstorming fresh ideas, asking for input from everyone. One of the biggest mistakes a leader could make, he realized, was shutting people down or pretending to have all the answers. He knew that he needed everyone on board, and he had to cultivate an environment where everyone's voice mattered. As the weeks passed, he saw a shift. People were becoming more energized. They started coming up with new ideas, new strategies, and solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable just a few months ago. Still, there were days when the doubt crept in. Every time he turned on the news, there was a new headline about the growing success of Melissa's company. She was on the cover of every major business magazine, hailed as one of the most influential CEOs of her generation. Her team was growing, and their sales numbers were off the charts. It stung every time he saw it, reminding him of just how high the stakes were. His company wasn't just struggling for survival, it was at risk of being swallowed up by the competition. One evening, after another long day of meetings, he sat alone in his office, staring out of the window. The city skyline was lit up in front of him, the twinkling lights of 1,000 businesses and homes serving as a constant reminder of the world he was trying to navigate. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger to him, someone who had come so far, but who now found himself standing on the edge of the unknown. He wasn't sure if he could pull this off, if he could beat the odds once again. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. But then he remembered something, a lesson from his past. When he was just a teenager, trying to get his foot in the door of the corporate world, he had been laughed at during the interview. People had mocked him, judged him based on his appearance, his age, and his background. He wasn't supposed to make it. But he had proved them wrong. He had fought for every inch of his success, never backing down, never accepting the limitations that others tried to impose on him. That was the turning point. The realization that failure wasn't an option. He wasn't going to let a corporate giant like Melissa Chang stand in his way. Not when he had already come this far. He stood up from his desk, his resolve hardening like steel. This wasn't just about competing anymore, it was about proving to everyone, especially himself, that he belonged in this world. He wasn't going to let his past define him, he was going to define his future. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting with his leadership team. The tone in his voice was different, sharper, more focused. They needed to act fast, to make a statement to both their employees and the world that they weren't backing down. He outlined a new approach, one that focused on innovation and branding, emphasizing the human side of their products. They weren't just another company trying to make a profit, they were a company with a vision, with a purpose. They had to start standing for something more. Forget what Melissa is doing for a second, he said, his voice steady and confident. What we need to do is set our own path. We can't just follow trends or copy what she's doing. We have to create something unique, something that resonates with people on a deeper level. We need to show the world that we're different. The team responded. Ideas began to flow. A new marketing strategy was developed that emphasized their commitment to social causes, using their platform to support underserved communities and advocate for meaningful change. The company's products would no longer just be about selling, they would be about making an impact. They would support artists, creators, and innovators, offering them a space to share their work. It was a gamble, a risk that could either propel them to success or ruin them. But at that moment, it was the only option. As the weeks passed, he began to see the seeds of his vision take root. The employees who had once been hesitant were now fully on board. There was an energy in the office that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. His team was united, all working towards a common goal. They weren't just trying to outdo the competition anymore, they were creating something new, something that could change the game entirely. But just as things seemed to be turning around, a new threat emerged. The rival company had caught wind of their new direction and was quick to respond. They launched their own campaign, one that directly countered the values his company was trying to promote. It was almost as if they had anticipated every move he would make, and now they were trying to drown out their voice before it could even be heard. Once again, he found himself standing at the precipice, wondering if he could make it through this latest challenge. But there was something different this time. The doubts weren't as strong. The fear wasn't as paralyzing. He had learned to trust in his team, in his vision, and in the resilience that had carried him through every hardship he had faced. But could it be enough? Would they be able to turn the tide in their favor, or would this be the moment where their efforts finally fell short? The stakes had never been higher, and the pressure had never been greater. Only one thing was certain, this battle was far from over. The tension in the office was palpable. Every day seemed like a battle. Despite the shift in strategy and the fresh energy among the team, the rival company's swift counterattack was an obstacle they couldn't ignore. The campaign that Melissa's team had launched was more than just a marketing move, it was a direct assault on the values his company had just begun to build. It wasn't just about products anymore, it was about identity. It was about who would define the future of the industry, and he couldn't afford to lose. As his team scrambled to refine their messaging and create a more compelling narrative, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He couldn't help but wonder if it was all too late. Melissa's company had the resources, the reach, and the reputation. They were a well-oiled machine, and he knew from experience that it wasn't easy to outdo a giant, no matter how innovative or passionate you were. One morning, as he walked into the office, he noticed the change. The usual buzz of activity was quieter, more subdued. People were still working, but it wasn't the same. It was as if they were all waiting for something, waiting for him to give them the spark they needed to push through the challenge. And yet, despite the outward calm, he could sense the unease beneath the surface. His leadership team was starting to look over their shoulders. More, their eyes flickering toward the competition. It was inevitable, he realized. The fear of failure had a way of seeping into the cracks, turning optimism into doubt. It was around this time that an unexpected source of tension surfaced. A confidential leak of internal strategy documents hit the press, and for a moment, everything unraveled. The timing was too perfect, too calculated. It wasn't just a mistake. Someone had intentionally revealed their plans. The leak threw everything into chaos, and suddenly, Melissa's company had the advantage. It wasn't just about responding to the market anymore. It was about damage control. The plan he had been so carefully crafting was now compromised. He called an emergency meeting, gathering his leadership team in the boardroom. As the room filled with anxious faces, he could feel the weight of everyone's expectations. No one had answers. No one had a solution. They were all looking at him, and for the first time since taking the helm, he felt as though he was standing in front of an insurmountable wall. "We need to find out who did this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Someone on the inside leaked our plans, and we can't afford to let that slide." The room fell silent. Every person in that room had access to the documents, and everyone knew how damaging this leak could be. They could no longer move forward with their strategy as planned, not with their competitors already prepared to capitalize on the information. His heart raced as he wondered if the leak was a calculated move from someone within the company who had been looking to undermine him from the start. As they went through the list of potential suspects, the atmosphere in the room became heavy. He knew that trust was now a fragile thing. If someone was capable of sabotaging their efforts, how could he trust anyone? His leadership team, the people he had believed in, were now all under suspicion. The unity they had worked so hard to build seemed to be crumbling, replaced by whispers and side conversations. Meanwhile, outside the office, the media was running wild with the story of the leak. Headlines flashed across screens, and journalists began to speculate on what this meant for the future of the company. They were painting him as the man who had failed before even beginning to lead, the CEO who couldn't keep his own house in order. Every comment on social media seemed to chip away at his confidence. He was no longer seen as the underdog, the challenger. It was starting to feel like he was the one being challenged by forces much greater than he had ever anticipated. But even amidst the uncertainty, something inside him refused to back down. He had been here before, facing failure, doubted by those who didn't think he belonged. But he had proven them wrong. He had made it this far. The leak, as devastating as it was, wasn't going to be the end of him. He wasn't going to let someone else's mistake define his company. And if the betrayal ran deeper than they imagined, if someone in the room had intentionally sabotaged their efforts, he wasn't going to let that go unpunished. The investigation into the leak became his obsession. He spent countless hours reviewing security footage, questioning employees, and digging into the backgrounds of those closest to him. There was a coldness in his approach that even surprised him. He wasn't just looking for the truth, he was looking for someone to blame. He needed a scapegoat. But the deeper he dug, the more tangled everything became. There were no clear answers, just more questions. Then came the rumors, the whispers that someone within the company had been working with Melissa's team all along. It was impossible to ignore. The speculation began to swirl, and the idea that someone had sold them out for the right price seemed more and more plausible. With every conversation, every meeting, he could feel the tension building. His leadership team was fracturing, relationships that had once seemed solid now riddled with doubt and mistrust. He knew that Melissa's company wasn't just a business rival anymore, they were a reflection of everything he had been fighting against. They were everything he had worked so hard not to become, the slick, polished corporation that cared more about profits than people. And yet, as his company struggled to keep its footing, he couldn't help but wonder if Melissa had known something he hadn't. Had she foreseen his every move? Had she always been one step ahead? The longer the investigation dragged on, the more the pressure mounted. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, an unexpected visitor appeared. Someone from his past, a former colleague who had been a trusted ally during the early years of his career. The meeting was brief, but the conversation would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew. "I know what you're up against," his old colleague said, eyes narrowed in a way that made him uneasy. "But you need to be careful. There's more at play here than you realize." He didn't know whether to believe the warning or dismiss it as paranoia. But something about it stuck with him. As he left the meeting, a sinking feeling took root in his stomach. The idea that the stakes were higher than he'd thought, that there were forces he couldn't control, made his pulse quicken. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. As he returned to his office, he knew that everything was about to change. He wasn't sure if it would be for better or worse, but he knew that he had crossed a line. The game had escalated, and there was no turning back now. The following weeks were a blur of endless meetings, frantic strategizing, and attempts to put out fires that seemed to sprout up at every corner. His leadership team was fractured, trust was a rare commodity, and the pressure to respond to Melissa's aggressive campaign was overwhelming. But despite the chaos, something inside him refused to give in. Every day, he woke up determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that his company's future was at stake. He spent countless hours poring over data, trying to figure out how to turn the tide. The leak had thrown them off course, but he couldn't allow it to be the final blow. He knew that Melissa's company wasn't invincible, no matter how well they presented themselves. They might have the resources, but he had something they didn't, the loyalty of his employees, the support of his customers, and a vision that, even if it wasn't always clear, was worth fighting for. Yet, as he moved forward, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something larger was at play. The betrayal within the company still hung over him like a shadow, and every day that passed without answers only deepened his suspicion. Was someone on the inside working against him? Was there more to the leak than just a simple mistake? He began to question the motives of everyone around him, even those he had trusted the most. The investigation continued, but the more they dug, the more elusive the truth became. No one seemed to know anything, and yet everyone seemed to be hiding something. It was as if there was a collective wall of silence, a conspiracy of sorts, that no one was willing to break. Employees had grown defensive, refusing to speak openly, and it became clear that the atmosphere of fear and mistrust was taking its toll. What had once been a company built on innovation and collaboration was now a battleground of suspicion and paranoia. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a cryptic message appeared on his desk one morning. It was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, with no return address or signature. The words written on it were simple, but the implications were chilling. Asterisk, you're not the only one who knows how to play the game. Asterisk, he stared at the note for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who could have sent it? What game were they talking about? His first instinct was to dismiss it as another empty threat, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that someone, somewhere, was playing a game far more dangerous than he could have imagined. He was no longer just fighting to save his company, he was fighting to uncover the truth, to expose the forces working against him, and to protect the people he had promised to lead. But with every step forward, the trail grew colder. Every lead seemed to fizzle out, every conversation seemed to bring more questions than answers. And then, one night, as he sat alone in his office, going over reports and trying to think of a new way to turn the situation around, a thought struck him. Maybe he had been looking in the wrong places. Perhaps the answers weren't hidden in the boardroom or the documents, maybe the truth lay somewhere else entirely. His mind raced, thinking back to his early days in the company, to the relationships he had built, and to the lessons he had learned. He had once believed that success was all about strategy, about outsmarting the competition. But now, more than ever, he realized that the true game was about understanding people, about knowing who could be trusted and who was playing their own game behind closed doors. But even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. Melissa's company was gaining ground, and every moment he spent chasing shadows was a moment they could use to solidify their position. Then, as if the universe had decided to intervene, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior employee, someone who had only recently joined the company, came forward with new information. The young woman, nervous but determined, had noticed something strange, something that didn't add up. She had overheard a conversation between two senior executives, a conversation that seemed too deliberate, too rehearsed. She had been hesitant to speak up, afraid of the consequences, but something told her that she couldn't remain silent. The information she provided wasn't much, but it was enough to send a shockwave through his office. The two executives in question were people he had trusted, people he had believed were fully aligned with his vision for the company. But now, as he sifted through the details, it became clear that they had been more involved in the leak than anyone had realized. They had known about the internal strategy, and they had been the ones to share it, either willingly or through coercion, with Melissa's team. He couldn't believe it. He had been betrayed by those closest to him, by people who had stood by his side, who had promised loyalty. The realization was like a punch to the gut. He had trusted them, had believed in them, and now they had sabotaged everything he had worked for. But even in the midst of the betrayal, he knew he couldn't let this defeat him. The game was far from over, and now he had a new mission, to expose the culprits, to reclaim control of his company, and to prove that even in the face of adversity, he was capable of leading his team to victory. But there was one problem: he still had to figure out how to navigate the fallout of this betrayal. How could he confront the executives without unraveling everything else? How could he protect the company from the damage that had already been done? As the days passed, the tension in the office grew even thicker. His team was on edge, unsure of who to trust. The investigation into the leak had taken a personal turn, and every person involved felt like they were walking a tightrope. The pressure was unbearable. But despite the storm swirling around him, he remained focused on one thing: he couldn't let this be the end. He had to keep pushing forward, no matter how deep the betrayal ran. The weight of the betrayal hung over him, but there was no time to dwell on it. Each morning felt like he was stepping into a new battle, and every decision he made carried consequences. As the internal investigation continued, he found himself torn between confronting the two executives responsible for the leak and protecting the rest of the company from further damage. Every move had to be calculated, every word carefully chosen. His leadership team, once united, had now fractured into factions. Some of his most trusted colleagues were beginning to question his ability to lead through the crisis. They had seen him as a visionary, but now they weren't so sure. Could he really recover from this betrayal? Could he still steer the company through these turbulent waters? The pressure was mounting from all sides. And yet, amid the chaos, a small part of him felt the fire reigniting. It was a familiar feeling, one that had always driven him to succeed against all odds. He had faced setbacks before, just not on this scale. He had worked his way up from nothing, from a young intern in a field dominated by those with more experience and connections. He had learned early on that the world didn't hand out success, you had to fight for it. Now, more than ever, that fight felt personal. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It wasn't just about the betrayal, or the leaks, or the competition. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of leading, of overcoming obstacles, and of winning in the end. He couldn't afford to lose sight of that. Not now. The idea of facing the executives responsible for the leak weighed heavily on his mind. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. He had always prided himself on maintaining a sense of loyalty and respect within the company, but this was different. This wasn't just a mistake or a bad decision, it was an intentional act of sabotage. His trust had been broken, and that was something that couldn't be repaired with a simple apology. The executives in question had shown themselves to be willing to undermine everything he had worked for, and now they had to be held accountable. The problem was, he couldn't afford to make this a public spectacle. If word got out that the company was fractured from the inside, it would be disastrous. Investors would pull out, employees would leave, and competitors would pounce. The damage would be irreparable. So, he made the difficult decision to keep the investigation under wraps for as long as possible, working in the shadows to gather evidence and prepare his case. The more he delved into the company's operations, the more he realized how deep the rot went. It wasn't just these two executives, it was a culture of secrecy and self-interest that had taken root. People were looking out for their own gain, not for the company's well-being. And that realization stung. How had it all gone so wrong? How had they allowed the culture to shift from one of collaboration and trust to one of greed and manipulation? But as he dug deeper, he found something else. A report, buried in a pile of financial documents, outlined the company's future strategy in a way that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just about a single leak. It was part of a larger plan. There were references to shifts in the market, moves to sabotage his leadership, and even talks of his eventual ousting from the company. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a corporate betrayal, it was an orchestrated attack against him personally. For the first time in weeks, he felt the full weight of the battle ahead. He was no longer fighting just to save his company. He was fighting for his career, his legacy, and his reputation. He was up against forces far more powerful and far more entrenched than he had imagined. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. It was going to be a war. He knew that he had to make his next move carefully. There was no room for mistakes. His next step would determine the future of the company, and possibly his own future. If he acted too quickly, he risked making things worse. If he waited too long, it could cost him everything. One afternoon, after hours of sifting through documents and meeting with his most trusted advisors, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the message was not. It was a warning. Someone high up in the organization, was about to make a move against him. The caller didn't provide specifics, but the implication was clear: the forces working against him were moving fast, and if he didn't act now, he would be swept aside. His heart raced as he hung up the phone. This was it. This was the turning point he had been waiting for. But what was he supposed to do with this information? Who could he trust? The paranoia that had been building for weeks now settled into a cold, hard certainty. He was surrounded by enemies, both within and outside the company. But who was behind the plot? Who was the mastermind pulling the strings? The next few days were a blur. Every conversation felt loaded with tension, every email and message seemed like a potential trap. The once familiar and supportive office environment had become a battlefield, where allegiances shifted in the blink of an eye. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who had stood by him through thick and thin. But despite the chaos, despite the uncertainty, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to go down without a fight. He had come too far, worked too hard, and sacrificed too much to let this happen. He wasn't going to let anyone steal what he had built. And as the days passed and the walls seemed to close in, he felt an inner resolve harden within him. He would find out who was behind this plot. He would confront them head-on. And he would win. But time was running out. And with every passing hour, the stakes grew higher. The air in the office had grown thick with suspicion. He could feel it every time he walked through the hallways, like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. No one spoke openly about the tension, but it was palpable, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every glance felt loaded, every conversation felt like a potential trap. He was walking on eggshells, knowing that the smallest misstep could be his downfall. The investigation had been going on for weeks, and the pressure was starting to take its toll. He had spent sleepless nights poring over financial records, meeting with his most trusted confidants, trying to piece together the puzzle. But every time he thought he was close to uncovering the truth, another layer of deception seemed to surface, deeper and more complex than he could have imagined. Whoever was behind this was careful, methodical, and ruthless. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The person who had warned him about the impending move against him was nowhere to be found. The silence in the office was deafening. His once strong network of allies had begun to fray at the edges. People he had trusted for years were suddenly avoiding him, keeping their distance. Some of them, he suspected, were already making deals with those who wanted him out. The thought gnawed at him. Who could he trust? How far did the conspiracy go? His days were spent in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions, but his mind was always elsewhere, always focused on the looming threat. Every move he made had to be calculated. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. He had to stay one step ahead of the game, even if he wasn't sure who the players were anymore. But just when he thought things couldn't get worse, they did. One morning, as he walked into the office, the atmosphere felt different. There was a tension in the air that seemed more intense than usual. His heart skipped a beat as he entered his office and found a file on his desk. It was sealed with an official company stamp, marked as urgent. His name was written in bold letters across the front. It wasn't from anyone he recognized. With shaking hands, he opened the file. Inside was a single page, containing a message that made his blood run cold. It was a detailed report of everything he had been working on, the internal investigation, the leaks, the corporate sabotage. But there was one detail that stood out, a warning. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The truth will come out soon, but by then, it will be too late. His mind raced. Who had sent this? What was going on? Was it a threat? Or was it a warning? Whoever had written it clearly knew everything he had been working on, everything he had uncovered. But how? He immediately called his most trusted advisor, his right-hand man, and briefed him on the situation. Together, they began to connect the dots, but everything seemed to lead back to one conclusion: the walls were closing in. The company he had spent years building, the company he had fought so hard to lead, was slipping through his fingers. And no matter how hard he tried to fight back, it seemed like there was always someone one step ahead. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. He doubled down on his investigation, trying to uncover any shred of evidence that could help him turn the tables. But every lead seemed to fizzle out, every ally seemed to grow more distant. Even his own family began to feel the strain, as his obsession with the company and the crisis consumed him. His wife, always his rock, grew increasingly frustrated with his inability to focus on anything other than work. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and love, were now tense and strained. Then, on the eve of an important board meeting that could determine the future of the company, he received another call. This time, it was from the same anonymous source who had warned him before. The voice on the other end was cryptic, urgent. You need to be careful. The time is now. They're making their move. He felt the blood drain from his face. He wasn't sure who they were, but the urgency in the voice was unmistakable. Something big was about to happen. And whatever it wasn't going to be good. As the day of the board meeting arrived, he could feel the tension building. The moment had come. This was his chance to take control, to expose the conspiracy and regain the trust of his team. But he also knew that if he failed, it would all come crashing down. The stakes had never been higher. He arrived early, hoping to get a sense of the room before the meeting started. The conference table was already set, the chairs neatly arranged. The board members began to trickle in, each of them looking more tense than the last. His heart pounded in his chest as he took his seat at the head of the table. The meeting began, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly scanning the room, looking for signs of who might be working against him. The first few topics were routine, but he could feel the undercurrent of tension growing stronger with every passing minute. Finally, when the time came for him to address the group, he stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he cleared his throat. He had prepared a statement, something to address the recent turmoil and reassure the board. But before he could even begin, one of the executives he had long suspected of being involved in the sabotage spoke up. "We have a serious issue," the executive said, his voice calm but laced with something darker. "There's been a leak. A major one. And I think we all know who's responsible." The words hung in the air like a weight, and every eye in the room turned toward him. He could feel the walls closing in. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading. The moment that would decide everything. The room fell deathly silent. The air was thick with tension as all eyes bore down on him, waiting for his reaction. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let the fear show. He had spent too many years building this company, too many sleepless nights strategizing and fighting for its success, to let it slip away now. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said, his voice firm but controlled. He locked eyes with the executive who had spoken, trying to maintain a facade of calm even as his mind raced. The executive didn't flinch. "I'm talking about the files that were leaked, the sensitive information that's been circulating outside the company. And it's clear that someone in this room is behind it." The accusation hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the board members shifting in their seats, eyes flicking nervously between one another. It was as if the room had become a pressure cooker, ready to explode at any moment. He could feel the sweat forming on his brow, but he didn't let it show. He was used to these high-stakes situations, used to being in the spotlight and under scrutiny. But something about this felt different. The walls, which had always seemed solid and impenetrable, were crumbling. The trust that had held the company together was now in question, and if he couldn't convince them of his innocence, it would all be over. For a brief moment, he considered revealing everything. Telling the board about the anonymous warning, about the investigation he had been conducting in secret, about everything he had uncovered. But he couldn't. Not yet. If the wrong people knew too much, it could be used against him. He had to be strategic. He had to keep playing the game. "I assure you, I have no idea where these leaks are coming from," he said, trying to project an air of confidence. "But I'm committed to getting to the bottom of this. We'll conduct a full investigation, and I'll personally make sure that those responsible are held accountable." His words hung in the air, but the skepticism in the room was undeniable. The executive who had spoken earlier didn't look convinced. In fact, no one did. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions guarded, as if they were weighing every word he said. Then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, one of the younger executives, a man who had been with the company for less than a year, stood up. His voice was surprisingly steady, considering the gravity of the situation. "I think we need to be clear about one thing," he said, his gaze shifting to the CEO. "If there's a mole in this company, we need to deal with it fast. Because if we don't, we're all at risk. And if we don't have a clear answer soon, the board will have no choice but to take action." The words sent a ripple through the room, and a wave of cold sweat trickled down his back. He had heard enough of these veiled threats in the past to know that this was more than just a warning, it was a declaration. The board was starting to turn on him. His enemies were closing in, and his allies were wavering. He stood there, caught in the middle of a battle he hadn't expected to fight. He had always thought the corporate world was about strategy, negotiation, and making the right moves. But now, it was personal. Now, it was about trust, betrayal, and survival. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of this mess. He needed evidence, something concrete that could prove he wasn't behind the leaks. But everything he had been working on had led to dead ends. Whoever was responsible was covering their tracks too well. The silence in the room deepened, each second feeling like an eternity. He could almost hear the clock ticking down, counting the seconds until his fate was sealed. And then, just as it seemed like everything would collapse around him, the door to the conference room swung open. A woman in a sharp suit entered the room, her expression unreadable. She was someone he had worked with for years, a trusted advisor, someone who had always been loyal. Her sudden appearance in the midst of this chaotic meeting was unusual. She didn't speak immediately, but instead, she handed him a folder, her eyes flicking nervously to the board members before returning to him. The CEO's heart skipped a beat. He knew that folder. It was the one piece of the puzzle he had been searching for, the missing link that could change everything. He opened it slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him as the board watched intently. Inside the folder was a single piece of paper, its contents brief but shocking. It was a list of names, All of them people he had trusted, people he had worked alongside for years. But it was the last name on the list that made his stomach churn, a name he hadn't expected to see. It was a name that tied everything together, a name that connected the dots in a way he hadn't anticipated. His hands shook as he read the name. It wasn't just one of the board members. It was someone much closer, someone who had been working with him all along, someone he had thought was his ally. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The plot had thickened. The stakes had just gotten much higher. The walls were no longer just closing in, they were crumbling around him. And now, with this new piece of the puzzle in his hands, everything he thought he knew was up for question. But the most terrifying part was that this wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. He glanced up at the board, his mind racing. They were waiting for him to speak, but for once, he didn't know what to say. The game had changed, and he wasn't sure he was prepared for what was about to happen next. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, but his mind was still reeling from the discovery in that folder. The name on the page kept echoing in his head, and with it, the realization that everything he had worked so hard to build, the company, the trust, the foundation, might have been a lie all along. The woman who had handed him the folder hadn't left the room, but she hadn't said a word either. Her eyes were fixed on him, and there was a silent understanding between them. She knew what he was feeling. She knew that this was a turning point, not just for the company, but for everything they had both fought for. She had risked her own position to bring him this information. But why? What was her role in all this? And more importantly, who else knew? His eyes drifted back to the folder, and he forced himself to read the name again. The person behind the leaks, the one pulling the strings, wasn't just any board member, it was someone much closer to him. A longtime mentor. Someone he had trusted implicitly. And now, this person was the key to everything. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind? The tension in the room was palpable as he stared at the name. The silence stretched out, almost unbearable, before one of the board members cleared their throat, breaking the stillness. So, what now? The voice was sharp, demanding answers. Are we to believe that the CEO didn't know about this? Or are we to think that he's been in on it all along? The room was closing in again, the stakes higher than ever. He had to make a decision. He could either throw his mentor under the bus, tell the board everything he had just discovered, and try to salvage his position, or he could lie and protect the person who had once been his guiding force. But lying wasn't an option. Not anymore. I didn't know, he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the truth. But I do now. The room erupted into murmurs. The younger executive, the one who had made the threat earlier, leaned forward, his face hardening. So, what exactly are you going to do about it? The question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. What could he do? The trust between him and his mentor had been shattered, but the damage to the company was still just beginning. He had to act fast. I'm going to take responsibility for this, he said, his voice firm. I will make sure that this betrayal is dealt with, and I will ensure that the company moves forward, no matter what it takes. But as soon as he said the words, a small part of him wondered if he truly believed them. Could he really lead a company built on lies? Could he forgive himself for the blind faith he had placed in someone who had ultimately been part of the conspiracy against him? The seconds seemed to drag on as the board members absorbed his words, some skeptical, others appearing slightly more sympathetic. The woman who had handed him the folder stepped forward, her eyes flickering nervously toward the door. There's more, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the tense silence. What do you mean, more? The executive who had first spoken demanded, his tone impatient. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking again. There are other names. People inside the company who have been working with your mentor. I found out some of them are planning to use this situation to take over the company. They think it's the perfect opportunity. A wave of dread washed over him. It wasn't just about leaks and betrayal anymore, it was about a hostile takeover. It was about losing everything he had worked for. The walls were closing in faster than ever, and the people he had considered allies were starting to turn on him, all in the name of power and control. His mind raced, running through all the options, the risks, the consequences. He couldn't just sit back and let it happen. But what could he do? I'll handle it, he said with more conviction than he felt. We'll expose this, root out the traitors, and ensure the company's survival. But I need your help. We have to act quickly. There was a moment of silence as the board members exchanged looks, some nodding in agreement while others seemed uncertain. The young executive spoke again, this time with a hint of skepticism in his voice. "And how exactly do you plan to prove all this? Do you have evidence? You've been under suspicion yourself." It was a valid point. He had nothing but the folder in his hands. Nothing concrete. Nothing that would convince the board to trust him again. The woman stepped forward again, this time with a document in her hands. "We have the evidence," she said, her voice steady now, confident. "The financial records, the emails, the communications. Everything. It's all here. I've been gathering it for months." His heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. This was the lifeline he needed. If he could present this evidence to the board, if he could show them the depth of the conspiracy, maybe, just maybe, he could salvage his position. But it would come at a cost. The truth would destroy more than just his mentor. It would shatter the company's reputation. The public fallout would be immense. But he couldn't back down. Not now. He took the document from her hands and turned it over, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. The weight of the truth was unbearable, and yet, he knew that this was the only way forward. The room had grown colder, the faces around him more judgmental, more wary. But he couldn't afford to back down now. His entire future, the company's future, depended on the next few moments. He had to convince the board to believe him. He had to prove that he wasn't just another victim of betrayal. He stood tall, his resolve hardening as he began to speak again. But just as he opened his mouth, there was a knock at the door. The tension in the room spiked, and the atmosphere shifted once again. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside, a figure he never expected to see. The last person he thought would walk through that door, the person who could either make or break everything. The CEO's eyes locked onto the newcomer's face, and for a moment, time stood still. The final piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed. The door creaked open slowly, and all eyes in the room turned toward the figure stepping inside. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes met the stranger's. It was impossible. He had hoped, no, prayed, that he'd never see this person again. Standing there in the doorway, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, was none other than his mentor, the very person who had betrayed him and the company. But this wasn't just any betrayal. The weight of this figure in the room, the very presence of someone who had been pulling strings from behind the scenes, made everything he'd just uncovered feel like a mere fraction of the truth. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Why was his mentor here now? Was this a calculated move? Was he trying to force his hand, put him in a position where the only way out was surrender? The air in the room felt thicker, charged with tension as the newcomer locked eyes with him, calm, confident, and utterly unfazed. "Is everything all right in here?" His mentor's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like he was trying to feign innocence in a game he already knew how to play. "I heard there was a little commotion. I'm sure we can sort this out." His words hung in the air, but the CEO felt the sting of betrayal deeper than ever before. He could hardly breathe. The folder, the documents, everything they had just uncovered about the conspiracy, was this part of a larger plan? He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just walked into a trap, one that had been set long before he even stepped into this room. "Why are you here?" His voice cracked, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. He was no longer in control of this meeting, not with his mentor standing there. "This isn't your place anymore." Enough," his mentor interrupted, stepping further into the room, his smile now gone, replaced by a cold, calculated look. "You're about to understand why I'm here. You've been playing a dangerous game, and you're just beginning to realize how deep it all goes." His mentor's words were like a spark in dry tinder, igniting a new sense of urgency. The tension in the room was palpable now, and he felt the eyes of every board member on him, some curious, others anxious. What was going on? Why had this man returned at this precise moment? What was he playing at? The woman who had given him the documents stepped forward, but her expression had shifted. There was no confidence in her eyes now, only doubt and fear. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice faltering. "We've already exposed the leaks, we have everything we need." His mentor's lips curled into a slight smirk. "You think you've exposed everything? You've uncovered the surface, but you haven't even scratched the real story. The truth is much bigger, more dangerous, than you can possibly imagine. And it's about time you realized it." The CEO's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the words. What was his mentor hinting at? Had all the evidence they had gathered been manipulated? Was there a bigger conspiracy that none of them had seen coming? The more he thought about it, the more the world he had built, his career, his vision, his integrity, seemed to crumble before his very eyes. You're wrong, he said, trying to steady his voice. We know what you've done. We know about the leaks, the backdoor deals, the sabotage. And we know it was you. His mentor tilted his head slightly, as if considering the accusation, before responding with chilling calmness. What you know, and what you think you know, are two very different things. You're still looking at this from the wrong perspective. Then enlighten us, the woman beside him demanded. What's really going on here? If you're telling the truth, then what's the real story? His mentor's gaze turned toward her, and for a moment, it felt like everything in the room shifted. The real story, my dear, is that you've all been played, he said softly, his tone almost reassuring. The person who thought they were in control. That's not who you should be worrying about. The CEO could feel his pulse racing. What was his mentor talking about? This didn't make sense. His hands clenched into fists, and he glanced around the room, trying to read the expressions of the board members. Some of them looked skeptical, while others seemed genuinely confused. The woman who had helped him? Her face was pale, as if she had heard something she hadn't expected. You're talking in circles, the CEO said, frustration seeping into his voice. Who's really behind this? Who's pulling the strings? His mentor's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. You still don't get it. You've been focused on the wrong people. The leaks? The sabotage? All of it? You're looking at the wrong faces. The tension in the room spiked once again, as the words sank in. His mentor's cryptic message hung in the air, thick with the promise of a deeper truth, one that could shatter everything the CEO had worked for, everything he had trusted. But what was it? Who was behind this all? And why hadn't he seen it coming? The woman beside him reached out, almost as if to steady herself, her hand trembling. Who? Who are you talking about? She whispered, as if she feared the answer. His mentor paused, letting the moment linger, stretching the silence until it was almost unbearable. Then, with a deep, deliberate breath, he spoke the name that would change everything. Your new CEO. The room fell into stunned silence. Every person there seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the implications of that one statement to settle. The CEO felt his heart drop into his stomach. He couldn't have heard that correctly. What? He finally managed to say, his voice cracking with disbelief. His mentor stepped closer, locking eyes with him. You've been looking for the enemy in the wrong places. The real person behind all of this? The one orchestrating everything? It's been you all along. The words felt like a blow to the chest, knocking the wind out of him. How could this be possible? How could he have been the one responsible for everything that had gone wrong? Could it be true? Was he the one being manipulated? He felt the weight of every decision, every move, every moment that had led him here, and it was as if the ground beneath him was slipping away. The room was spinning. The board members' faces blurred as confusion and disbelief overwhelmed him. His mentor's voice, calm and steady, continued, but it barely registered. You've been set up. You're the fall guy. And with that final, devastating revelation, the room fell into chaos. The real battle was only just beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever before. But the CEO couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a taut wire ready to snap at any moment. The CEO could barely process the words his mentor had just spoken. The fall guy, he muttered under his breath, his mind spinning. He had always believed in his own righteousness, in the purity of his intentions, and the hard work that had led him to this point. But now, standing at the precipice of everything he thought he knew, doubt began to creep in. Impossible, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, battling his way to the top, never imagining that the very foundation of his success might be built on lies. The thought that he had been used, manipulated into being the scapegoat in a much larger game, was a bitter pill to swallow. The boardroom was eerily silent, the weight of his mentor's words hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Some of the members exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to do or say. Others appeared deep in thought, their minds racing to piece together the fragmented puzzle before them. But the woman, who had been his ally, now seemed almost as lost as he was. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling. "You're saying all of this was planned? That we've been manipulated?" The mentor's eyes glinted with a cold, almost calculating amusement. "You've been pawns in a game much bigger than you realize. The leaks, the sabotage, it was all meant to steer you in the wrong direction, to make you focus on the wrong people." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "And now, the time has come for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place." The CEO's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He had always trusted his instincts, but now they felt like lies. He had always believed in doing the right thing, but what if the right thing was never within his control to begin with? What if everything had been orchestrated, from the very start? He looked at his mentor, who stood there with a self-assured smirk, as if he had orchestrated every move, every consequence. "Who's behind all of this?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's really pulling the strings?" The mentor didn't hesitate. "You already know the answer to that question. But you've been blind to it. All of you have." The words were like a slap to the face. The CEO's stomach churned, and a wave of nausea washed over him. Who could have orchestrated such a thing? Who had the power to manipulate an entire company, to twist everything to their will, and to turn someone as strong-willed as him into an unwitting pawn? His heart raced, his thoughts clouded. For a moment, he couldn't think. Everything around him seemed to blur together. The mentor had mentioned a final piece. What did that mean? What was the last move in this game of corporate chess? And who, exactly, had been playing? "Are you saying this whole time, I've been the one who's been set up to fall?" The CEO's voice cracked, and he couldn't hide the disbelief that laced his words. He had given everything to this company, his heart, his soul, and now he was hearing that it had all been for nothing? The mentor stepped closer, his voice lowering, taking on an almost conspiratorial tone. "You've been so focused on uncovering the leaks, the sabotage, that you missed the bigger picture. It's always been about the control. The control over you." The woman who had given him the documents spoke up, her voice wavering. "You've been behind everything? Even the sabotage?" The mentor nodded slowly, the look on his face almost one of amusement, as if he were savoring the chaos he'd set in motion. "It was always about power, about keeping control of the company. I knew from the beginning that if I could push the right buttons, I could take down anyone who stood in my way. And now, it's your turn." The room felt smaller, suffocating. The CEO could hardly breathe. He felt like a character in someone else's story, someone who had been written into a plot he never understood. Every move he had made, every decision he had fought for, seemed insignificant now. Was it all just a carefully crafted illusion? "You're lying," the CEO finally managed to say, his voice raw with emotion. "You can't just throw me under the bus like this." His mentor's gaze was unwavering. "I'm not throwing you under the bus, my friend. I'm simply revealing the truth. You've been set up to take the fall, and now you'll have to deal with the consequences." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The room was filled with the sound of heavy breathing, the quiet shuffling of feet, the tension hanging thick in the air. The words that had just been spoken seemed to echo in the CEO's mind. He wasn't sure how to respond, or if there even was a response that would make any sense. It felt like the world around him was falling apart, and he was just standing in the middle of it, helpless. But as the minutes ticked by, he realized that there was still one thing left. One thing he could do. "Who's the real enemy?" he asked, his voice steady now, though his heart was still racing. "Who is really behind this?" The mentor's expression darkened. He looked at the CEO with something that almost resembled pity. "It's not who you think it is. It's someone you never expected. Someone who's been right in front of you the entire time." The revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. The CEO's mind raced once again, trying to figure out who could be the mastermind behind all of this. He couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces were right there, just out of reach, taunting him with their implications. But who was the person that had orchestrated this entire scheme? And how far did it go? His eyes flicked around the room, studying the board members. There had to be someone here who knew more. Someone who understood the bigger picture. He couldn't help but wonder if the people closest to him, the ones who had been by his side throughout everything, had been complicit in this entire plan. And just like that, the realization hit him like a lightning bolt. He turned to face the woman who had been his ally, the one who had handed him the documents and helped him uncover the conspiracy. Her eyes met his, and for a split second, he saw something flicker in her gaze. Something unfamiliar. Could she be the one behind all of this? The room seemed to close in around him, the tension unbearable, as the final, life-altering question hung in the air. Who could he trust? The silence in the room was deafening as the CEO stared at the woman who had once been his trusted ally. Her eyes flickered for just a moment, too quick for anyone else to notice, but not for him. His pulse quickened, the pieces finally falling into place. The clues had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, and now, in this moment of unbearable tension, he saw them for what they truly were. "You're behind this, aren't you?" The words slipped from his lips before he could stop them. His voice was steady now, no longer a mere whisper of disbelief, but filled with the certainty that had eluded him for so long. The woman's face went pale, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she didn't deny it. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The room held its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. His mentor, the one who had revealed the plan, stood back, watching, like a puppeteer waiting for the final strings to be pulled. The others in the room exchanged glances, uncertain of how to react, but none dared speak up. "You thought I didn't know, didn't you?" the CEO continued, his voice calm but piercing. "You thought I would just keep following your lead, keeping my head down and doing your dirty work. But all along, I was being played. I was the one who was meant to fall, me, the person who had trusted you above anyone else." His eyes never left the woman, whose gaze was now lowered, ashamed. She took a deep breath before finally speaking. "You were always the plan, from the very beginning. But I never thought it would come to this." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion that bubbled beneath the surface. "I didn't want to hurt you, but they gave me no choice." His heart raced. He had known it, deep down, that the betrayal had come from someone close, but hearing it aloud, hearing her confess, stung more than he had imagined. "They? Who are they?" His voice was harsh now, laced with frustration, but also with the desperate need to understand. The woman's eyes flicked to the mentor, the man who had been his mentor for so long, the one who had set the whole scheme into motion. A wicked smile spread across his face as he stepped forward, looking between them both. "I wasn't the mastermind," he said with a shrug, almost casually. "I just made sure you were where you needed to be." She was the one who actually made it all happen. The CEO felt the world spinning. His eyes darted back to the woman. She hadn't been just another pawn in this game, she had been the one pulling the strings. The thought was dizzying, and the magnitude of it all made his stomach churn. But there was one more thing. A piece of the puzzle still didn't fit. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this? You had everything." "You didn't need to, I did need to," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. The company was never meant to be yours. It was always meant to be mine. But the only way to get it was to use you, use your ambition, your drive. I couldn't just walk in and take over, I needed someone who could be a distraction, someone who could shield me from suspicion." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. It all made sense now, the way she had helped him with the leaks, the way she had nudged him along in the right direction. It had never been about partnership. She had been using him from the start, weaving a web that, to him, had seemed like nothing but business as usual. "But the leaks, the sabotage, that was all you're doing?" The CEO's voice trembled, his anger bubbling up, but there was a tightness in his chest, a knot of disbelief. It was so surreal, so impossible, and yet here it was, unraveling before his eyes. She nodded. "I couldn't risk you finding out too soon. I needed you to be consumed by the internal problems, so you wouldn't see the real game I was playing." The CEO's heart raced, his mind reeling. But just as the truth seemed to settle in, a new thought occurred to him, and it was worse than he ever could have imagined. If she was the one pulling the strings, if she had orchestrated this entire fiasco, then was she the real power behind the scenes all along? A chill ran down his spine as he thought back to the mentor, the man who had guided him to this point. He looked at him now, the smirk still playing at the corners of his lips, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. "It was you, wasn't it?" the CEO said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were the one who set all of this in motion." The mentor chuckled softly, nodding. "I only helped you become the CEO. But I always knew you would be a pawn in someone else's game. I didn't count on this kind of betrayal, but I suppose you've learned more than I expected. The CEO's world was shattering, and for a moment, he couldn't see past the anger, the rage that built up within him. His entire journey, his struggle, everything he had worked for, had been nothing but a well-executed plot for power. The dream he had fought for had been carefully curated, crafted to lure him into a trap. But just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, there was one more revelation, one final twist that sent shockwaves through his very core. From the back of the room, another figure emerged. It was a person the CEO hadn't noticed before, someone who had stayed quiet and out of sight for the entirety of the confrontation. The figure stepped forward, and the room seemed to freeze. Actually, all of this was my plan, the newcomer said, his voice cool and calm, as if this were all just another day in the office. The CEO's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the man immediately. It was someone from his past, someone he thought he had left behind long ago. A former colleague. Someone who had been quietly observing from the shadows all this time. The man smiled. You were never meant to be CEO. You were always meant to fall. The final twist left him reeling. The true mastermind, the one who had set everything in motion, wasn't anyone he had suspected. The real game was even bigger than he had realized. In that moment, as the room spun with revelations and broken dreams, the CEO understood something crucial. Nothing in this world, not ambition, not success, not power, was ever as it seemed. And now, in the end, the only question left was how far he would go to take back control from the hands that had always held his future in their grip. The room fell into a heavy silence, as if the very air was thick with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The CEO stood frozen, his mind desperately trying to catch up with the series of shocks that had been thrown at him. The man who had just spoken, the one from his past, wasn't just some bystander in this drama. He was the mastermind behind it all, the one who had carefully engineered every move, every decision, every betrayal. He had been the one pulling all the strings from the shadows, setting in motion the intricate plan that had unraveled the CEO's life. The CEO's pulse hammered in his ears. His whole world had been built on lies, on manipulation, and on betrayal. Every move he had made, every decision he had thought was his own, had been part of a carefully crafted narrative written by others. The realization hit him harder than any punch could. This wasn't just about the company, about ambition or power, it was about control. It was about making sure that no matter who fought for what, the ultimate prize would always belong to the puppet masters who pulled the strings. The former colleague, the one who had now revealed himself as the ultimate architect of this conspiracy, took a step closer. His calm demeanor was unnerving, as if he knew the CEO had no way out of this. You never stood a chance, you know, he said with a casual chuckle, his voice laced with a sense of superiority. You thought you were playing the game. But the truth is, you were just another piece in it. A pawn. A tool to get what I needed. The CEO's stomach churned with disgust, but beneath the anger, there was something else, a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal that shook him to his core. He had trusted this person once. He had been there for him in his early days, offering advice, guidance, and support. And now, he realized that every word had been part of the plan, a carefully crafted illusion meant to manipulate him into playing the role that had been assigned to him. You used me, the CEO said, his voice trembling with both fury and disbelief. You used everything, my trust, my ambition, my hard work, to get what you wanted. The man smiled, a cold, calculating grin that sent a shiver down the CEO's spine. Of course, I used you. But the thing is, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. People like you, people with ambition and drive, are always so easily manipulated. It's so easy to make you believe that you're in control when, in reality, you're just following orders. He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the CEO. But you're right about one thing. You've worked hard. And now, you've earned your place in the story. The question is, what are you going to do with it? For the first time, the CEO felt the weight of what had been said. He had been a puppet, a player in a game that he hadn't even known existed. But there was one thing the man hadn't accounted for. The CEO wasn't done yet. No, not by a long shot. He had been pushed to the edge, but he wasn't going to back down. Not when he had come so far. Not when he had fought so hard. The anger inside him began to burn hotter, stronger. He had been played, yes, but he wasn't going to let this be the end of his story. He wasn't going to let these people take everything from him. They thought they had him trapped, that he was just another casualty in their carefully planned game. But they were wrong. "Do you really think this is the end for me?" the CEO asked, his voice now steady, full of resolve. "You think I'm just going to let you walk away with everything you've stolen from me?" The man's grin faltered for just a moment, and that was all the CEO needed to see. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. He had been down, yes, but now he was fighting back. He could feel it, his heart pounding with the rush of adrenaline. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Before anyone could react, the CEO made a swift move, turning to the woman who had once been his ally. "You," he said, his voice like ice, "you played me. But now it's your turn to face the consequences." She looked at him, eyes wide, a mix of regret and fear flashing across her face. She had once been the one who had smiled and helped him climb the ladder, only to stab him in the back at the highest point. And now, it was her time to fall. But the CEO wasn't done yet. He had learned too much from all this, about manipulation, about power, and about how quickly things could turn. He wasn't going to be a victim any longer. He wasn't going to let these people think they could use him and discard him so easily. "I may have been your pawn," he said, his voice growing stronger, "but I'm not anymore. This game is far from over." The room seemed to hold its breath as the CEO turned back to the man who had orchestrated everything. "You want the company?" he asked, a fierce edge to his voice. "You think you've won? I've got news for you. You've underestimated me. And that's your biggest mistake." For the first time, the CEO saw the smallest flicker of doubt in the eyes of his former mentor. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And that was enough. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and he could feel the tension building to a breaking point. The final showdown was coming, and the stakes had never been higher. Who would emerge victorious? Who would be left standing in the end? Only one thing was certain: the CEO wasn't going to let this be the end of his story. He would fight, and he would win. The question now was how far he was willing to go to claim his power back and take control of the company he had once dreamed of leading. The tension in the room was thick as the CEO's words hung in the air like a challenge. The man who had once been his mentor and guide stood frozen, clearly calculating his next move. The CEO had made it clear that he was no longer the pawn, no longer a tool to be manipulated. The battle lines had been drawn, and neither side was willing to back down. "I didn't underestimate you," the man said slowly, his voice cold, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a sign of doubt, perhaps, or maybe just the realization that the CEO was no longer the same person who had entered this room days ago. "I just never thought you'd fight back this hard. You've always been so compliant. You were the perfect candidate for my plan, the one I could control." The CEO's heart hammered in his chest, but his voice was steady. "You never understood me. You thought you could control me with your tricks and lies, but you didn't realize one thing: you were never the one in charge. I always had a choice. And I'm choosing to fight. You may have started this game, but I'm going to finish it." The room was silent except for the sound of the air conditioning humming in the background. Everyone was waiting, as if the very next words spoken would determine the fate of the company, and perhaps their lives. The woman who had once been on his side now stood frozen, her face a mixture of guilt and confusion. She had played a key role in the CEO's rise to power, and now she was realizing that her actions had been part of something much larger, much darker than she could have ever imagined. The CEO had come to terms with his betrayal, but it was clear that she hadn't. "I never wanted this for you," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "I didn't realize the full extent of what was happening. I thought I was just helping you climb the ladder, but now I see it was all a game. You were just a part of it." The CEO's gaze softened for a brief moment. He remembered the days when she had been his ally, the one person who had believed in him. But those days were over. She had made her choices, and now it was time for him to make his. "You were part of it," he said, his voice cold now. "But you don't get to be a victim. You chose this path. You can't claim innocence now." His words stung her deeply, and she recoiled slightly, as if the truth was too much to bear. The once bright future that she had envisioned for herself now seemed distant and unreachable. The power she had once so eagerly craved had come with a price that she hadn't been willing to pay. But now it was too late. There was no going back. The former mentor's face twisted into a smirk as he watched the exchange. He had always been the puppeteer, pulling the strings from the shadows, and seeing his carefully orchestrated plan unravel before his eyes seemed to please him more than it should have. You think you're going to change anything? He asked, his tone almost mocking. You're nothing more than a distraction. A blip in the bigger picture. The company is mine, and nothing you do can change that. But the CEO wasn't backing down. He had come too far, fought too hard to let someone like him dictate his future. You don't get to decide that anymore, he said, his words dripping with finality. This company, this power, it's mine now. And I'm taking it back. The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the man to respond. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence between them. The CEO knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been. He had been pushed to the edge, humiliated, betrayed, but now he stood strong, ready to take back what was rightfully his. He could feel the tension building, the energy in the room crackling like a storm waiting to break. And then, with a sudden, unexpected movement, the door to the room burst open. A figure stood in the doorway, casting a long shadow over the confrontation. The CEO turned, his heart racing. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had helped him in the beginning. She had left the room in defeat, but now she was back. She was holding something in her hand, something that made everyone freeze. I'm not done yet, she said, her voice steady and fierce. This is far from over. The room seemed to hold its breath. What had she brought? What was her role in all of this now? She stepped forward, her eyes locked on the former mentor, the man who had orchestrated everything. There was something different in her gaze, something that hadn't been there before, determination. She had chosen her side. You think you have control, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. But you don't. The game's changed, and I'm not playing by your rules anymore. The former mentor's face twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? You're too late. It's already over. But the woman shook her head. It's only just begun. The CEO watched in stunned silence as she walked toward him, the object in her hand now revealed to be a folder. I've been working behind the scenes, she said quietly, gathering evidence, uncovering lies. I've seen everything. And I'm not letting him walk away with this. The former mentor's eyes narrowed. You think you can stop me with a few papers? You've underestimated me, just like everyone else. The company's mine. And you're all just pawns in my game. But the woman stood firm, her eyes filled with resolve. You're wrong. You've been playing a game for too long. Now, it's our turn to play. And we're not going to let you win. The stakes had never been higher, the tension more unbearable. The final showdown was approaching. The pieces were on the board, and the CEO now understood what had been at stake all along. He wasn't just fighting for his job or the company. He was fighting for his life, for his freedom. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. What would happen next? Would the former mentor finally get what he deserved? Would the CEO claim his power back and take control of the company, or would the master manipulator continue to pull the strings from the shadows? Only time would tell. The room was thick with tension as the woman stepped closer to the CEO, the folder in her hand a silent weapon against the storm of manipulation that had raged in the company for far too long. Every word that had been spoken seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, no one moved, as if they were waiting for the final moment of truth to unfold. The former mentor, whose eyes had once shone with arrogance and control, now flickered with something far less confident, uncertainty. He had always believed that he could manipulate everyone around him, that no one would ever rise above him, but now, in this room, it was clear that his empire was crumbling. What is that? He spat, his voice shaking, trying to hold on to the little power he still had. What could you possibly have that would make a difference now? The woman didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Instead, she slid the folder across the table, her gaze unwavering. The CEO looked down at the contents, his heart racing as he read through the documents. They were proof. Proof of the former mentor's manipulation, his lies, and his deceit. Contracts that were altered, company funds misused, employees being exploited, all laid bare for the world to see. The woman had done what no one else had dared to do. She had gathered the evidence, connected the dots, and now she held the key to ending the tyrant's reign. The former mentor's face drained of color as the gravity of the situation hit him. For the first time in years, he was powerless. The very thing he had built up, brick by brick, on lies and deceit, was collapsing right before his eyes. He was no longer the puppet master. He was the one who was being exposed. The CEO stood up, his posture now commanding. You've taken everything from me, my dignity, my future, my confidence, but you forgot one thing. You underestimated my strength. You thought you could break me, but you didn't realize that I was never as weak as you wanted me to be." The former mentor opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. It was over. The damage had been done. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. The CEO turned to the woman, who was watching him, her expression softening for the first time since she had entered the room. "You did it," the CEO said quietly. "You saved me. You saved all of us." She smiled faintly, but there was no arrogance in her eyes. Only quiet pride. "I didn't do it alone. We did it together." The CEO's gaze flicked to the door where the other employees were still waiting, unsure of what had been happening behind closed doors. It was time to end this. It was time to take back control. Turning to face the room, he addressed them all. "We've been under the rule of a man who believed he could control us, that he could play with our lives for his gain. But today, we stand united. Today, we take back what's ours. This company belongs to all of us, not just one man who sees us as nothing more than tools for his ambition." The crowd in the room murmured in agreement, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, the CEO could see the faces of those who had once been subjugated, their expressions now filled with hope instead of fear. There was no longer a puppet master in the shadows. There was no longer a person who could manipulate their every move. The reign of lies had ended. The CEO turned back to face the former mentor, who was now sitting, defeated, his face contorted with disbelief. The woman stepped forward and made the final call. "It's over. The company is moving forward, and so are we. You won't have a place here anymore." The former mentor stood up, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and realization. He was no longer in control. He could no longer rely on his manipulations and deceptions. He was powerless. The CEO had taken back what was his, not just the company, but his dignity, his voice, and his future. The one who had laughed at him all those years ago, the one who had been dismissed as weak, was now standing in front of him, victorious. As the former mentor was escorted out of the building, the CEO felt a sense of peace wash over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time, he could breathe freely again. The fight wasn't over, there would be many more challenges ahead, but he had learned something valuable: strength doesn't always come from the position you hold or the power you think you wield. It comes from within, from knowing who you are and what you stand for. And no one, no matter how powerful, could ever take that away. The woman who had been by his side throughout the journey turned to him with a small smile. "Are you ready to take on what comes next?" The CEO nodded, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. He had taken back control, but now, it was time to lead, not with fear, not with manipulation, but with integrity, vision, and the will to create something better for everyone. Together, they walked out of the conference room, the future uncertain but brighter than ever. The once distant dream of being in charge had become a reality, not through luck, not through manipulation, but through resilience, unity, and the belief that one person's strength could spark a change for everyone. The CEO looked around the room once more, at the faces of the employees who had supported him, who had believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. They were no longer just employees. They were a team, a family, and together, they would rebuild. The company was no longer a battleground for power. It was a place of growth, opportunity, and collaboration. And as he stepped into his new role, he knew this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, but he was ready. Because now, he was more than just the CEO. He was the leader of something greater than himself. He was the living proof that no matter where you start, no matter the setbacks, the strength to overcome, to rise, and to lead is something that no one can ever take from you. As the doors to the building closed behind him, a new chapter in his life began, one of hope, growth, and the unwavering belief that he could change the world, one step at a time. The sound of the door closing behind them felt like the final piece of a long, painful puzzle snapping into place. For the CEO, it wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was the beginning of something far bigger. As he and the woman walked together down the hallway, the weight of their journey was heavy, but the promise of the future was even heavier. They had overcome the impossible, but now the real work began. Outside the building, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. The hustle and bustle of the streets continued around them, but for the CEO, everything had changed. The world felt different, the air fresher, the possibilities endless. There was no longer a shadow of doubt hanging over him. He had proved to himself that strength was not about who you were or where you came from. It was about having the courage to stand up for what was right, to fight for yourself, and to never, ever back down. The woman beside him gave him a knowing glance, her smile one of quiet approval. She had been there, every step of the way, and she knew better than anyone how far he had come. But she also knew that while the battle for control had been won, the real challenge lay in what they did next. "We've done it," the CEO said quietly, his voice filled with awe. "But this is only the beginning. We have so much more to build." She nodded, her eyes focused ahead. "We've proven that the system can be changed, but it's up to us now to make sure it stays changed. We have to be the leaders this company needs." The CEO smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone. The employees, the people who had believed in him when he had nothing to offer but a vision. Now, with everything falling into place, he was ready to shape that vision into something real. They stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, the noise of the city fading as they took a moment to breathe. The building behind them now felt like a distant memory, something that was no longer a part of who they were, but a stepping stone towards something greater. The future wasn't just about surviving the past, it was about creating a new path forward. "We're not just going to change the company," the CEO said, his voice full of conviction. "We're going to change the industry. We're going to show the world that success doesn't come from exploitation, doesn't come from manipulation. It comes from collaboration, trust, and hard work." The woman smiled again, but this time, it was a wider smile, one of pride and certainty. She knew that he was ready to lead, to take everything they had learned and use it to shape a better tomorrow. Together, they could accomplish anything. As the evening light bathed the city in golden hues, they walked toward the next chapter. The world had been watching, and now, they would see what true leadership looked like. The CEO was no longer a victim of circumstance, no longer the underdog. He had risen to become someone who could inspire, someone who could change not only a company but the lives of everyone who worked there. As they walked into the future, the CEO realized that he didn't need the validation of those who once laughed at him or tried to bring him down. He had already found his worth. His success was no longer defined by the approval of others, it was defined by his own ability to rise above, to lead with integrity, and to build something that would stand the test of time. And as they disappeared into the horizon, the city continued to pulse with energy, unaware of the revolution quietly unfolding within the walls of that very company. But the CEO knew. He knew that the change was just beginning, and with every step he took, the world was a little bit closer to seeing that true success is built on a foundation of strength, unity, and the unwavering belief that anything is possible. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, the CEO was ready. The story of the underdog had ended, but a new story was just beginning, one where he, and everyone who believed in him, would lead the way. The journey was far from over, but with the courage and wisdom gained from the struggles of the past, there was nothing that could stop him now.